Okay, let's get started here for today. Welcome everyone to today's University of Texas Energy Symposium, brought to you by the Energy Institute. I'm Kerry King, research scientist and assistant director of the University of Texas Energy Institute. And before I introduce today's speaker, I will point out the upcoming talks. Next week, we will have Chris Lamb from Sandia National Laboratories. He will talk to us about cyber warfare and critical infrastructure in the 21st century. So he is an expert on cybersecurity and the energy systems. The following week after that, 2 weeks from now, we will have Daniel Rosler, who is the founder and CIO of Utility API, is a company that organizes data on electric utilities and how we can use this data to ensure a better operation of our electric grid and other energy systems. But today, it is my pleasure to have Hector Pollitt, who is a senior economist at the World Bank and someone I've been collaborating with a little bit and speaking with on the topic that he's going to speak on today, which is macroeconomic modeling and energy and climate change. So a little background on Hector. He's currently a senior economist at the World Bank. He focuses on interactions between climate change policy and economic development, primarily in East and Southeast Asia. And he contributes to the World Bank's country climate and development reports and other climate inputs and discussions of climate in that region. Before joining the World Bank, he was the head of modeling and the chief economist at Cambridge Econometrics in the United Kingdom. He has extensive experience of macroeconomic modeling for climate and energy policy, and has contributed to several high-profile European policy assessments over the past decade. Has a bachelor's in mathematics and economics from the University of Nottingham, and he is currently finishing a PhD on integrating complexity to standard economic frameworks within the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. It's abstract here. I usually don't read all of it. I may roughly read all of it just to get on the record what he's kind of speaking about. The global energy transition is rapidly taking shape, driven by the declining cost of solar power, batteries, and the rise of electric vehicles. As the age of combustion comes to an end, two critical questions emerge. Will the transition occur swiftly enough to prevent dangerous climate change? And how will our economies and societies adapt to this new energy paradigm? These questions are crucial for economists to address, yet current mainstream economic models fall short, which is why I've invited Hector today. Traditional economic assumptions of perfect knowledge and rational, price-driven behavior fail to explain why technologies become cheaper or why they are not immediately adopted when they surpass alternatives in their cost effectiveness. Additionally, a limited understanding of innovation within these models hinders our ability to predict societal evolution during a transition. Economic growth is often viewed as a more of the same rather than the emergence of new products and systems. So today he will tell us how alternative economic approaches, those from evolutionary and complexity economics, can offer more valuable insights. So revisiting ideas from economists of the past, Veblen, Keynes, and Schumpeter, we aim to identify policy needs and solutions that both accelerate the energy transition and manage the socio-economic challenges it will bring. This emphasizes interdisciplinary and pluralistic thinking to uncover enormous potential benefits, more nuanced perspectives on the energy transition. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Hector. As usual, please submit your questions within the question and answer feature of Zoom or potentially online on YouTube where I can see them. And with that said, I will hand it over to Hector Pollitt.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope my slides have now appeared on screen.
It looks good.
Great. Yeah, greetings from Washington, D.C. So we are under severe weather warning here, so I'm at home. I've been sent home from the World Bank. I hope it doesn't get severe enough to affect the connection. Please shout if it does. So yeah, I'm here. I work for the World Bank on climate policy. I always have to give the disclaimer that I'm not giving the official view of the World Bank in any way at all. The World Bank is an organization of about 17,000 people, so it doesn't really have an official view on anything, so to speak. It's a collection of diverse views, but these are very much my own and from my own research. I broke the presentation up into four parts. The first bit on start asking some very basic questions about climate change and why we're going through this energy transition. Bear with me on that because it does come back in the later stages, and that is quite important. Then, of course, where we get to with current economics and how we can improve on that, and the lessons that we can take from that, which is really the more interesting bit. So, yeah, starting with the 101 question: why do we care about climate change? I can put this up because I'm online and not here in person when I'm getting booed off the stage already. There are lots of different answers to this question. And just say it on this slide. Some people see it as a moral obligation. I have a lot of sympathy with that view. Sort of, we are the shepherds or the stewards of our planet. We want to pass it on to future generations as we found it, without causing irreversible damage. There's also the more economist, so dare I say it, type view that it's in our own interest to do so because we generate prosperity and wealth from the planet, and if we damage the planet systems, we cannot do that. Now, that view is very prevalent amongst economists, but I would say in the wider population, the moral obligation actually may be the one that we see around more. This will come through again later in the slides, but in some sense, it doesn't really matter. The climate change is happening. We can see the effects already. We can see it's getting worse, and vulnerable populations are being affected by it. And for either of those reasons, we need to do something about it, and hence the energy transition. So moving to the climate target. So the Paris Agreement, coming from the UN negotiations, is basically how we have decided to tackle climate change at the global level. Now, we have these targets of keeping global temperature change below 2 degrees, ideally pushing towards 1.5 degrees. It often gets asked why these numbers. I mean, they're very nice, raw numbers. They can be communicated easily, but it's not the case that if we go to 2.01 degrees, disaster is going to happen. The reason we have these targets is simply because up to these boundaries, we can be reasonably confident that there will be a limit on the damages to natural systems and therefore to humanity from climate change. Once we start to exceed those boundaries, we don't know what will happen. There's too much uncertainty there. So we have a precautionary principle kind of based on an insurance type approach that we just do whatever we can not to go there because we don't know what will happen and we don't really want to find out. So uncertainty, very much a driver of all of this. Now, this is a critical slide. What do we have to do to meet the targets? Now, this is where, and I'm going to talk about this more, standard economics starts to fall short because it doesn't really think from a technology perspective. Now, okay, starting at the top, institutions, this is a definition. And what do we mean by institution? It encompasses behavior and technology. This has been around for over 100 years in institutional economics. But really, when we're talking about climate change and the solutions to climate change, it's the technology part that's the most important. And simply put, we need to get the right technologies into the right places so that we can carry on living our lives at a standard comparable to today without contributing to climate change. Now, if we take that as our starting point, getting the right technologies into the right places, we get to these conditions like what needs to be in place for this to happen, right? And we have these barriers, the 4 sub-bullet points. First of all, the technologies need to exist. That seems pretty obvious and pretty basic. Outside economics, I don't think that would be really something that's very controversial at all. But just put the question to an economist with their standard approaches and say carbon tax will be the solution to everything. Is a carbon tax going to do any good if the technologies that we need to change behavior do not exist? I mean, the answer, at least in the short term, is obviously not. But that's actually just getting that across. You see eyes open very widely in certain quarters when you make that point. Okay, say the technologies exist. The second point, people need to know about them. And it's more than they just need to know about them, they need to trust them as well. And kind of this is where we are we've been going through this process with electric vehicles. I mean, initially, nobody really knew about them at all. Then people started to find out. There was a lot of misinformation out there as well. But gradually, parts of the population have begun to trust that they will be able to provide what these people need to get around. And they have, in the end, started buying these cars. But there's a very much a process of knowledge being shared amongst the population here. The third point, people can use these technologies. Again, may sound obvious, but plenty of places around the world, there are regulations that stop technologies being taken up, particularly in the power sector, like with linking solar power to national grids, things like that, incumbent operators. So that's an important point. And then the final one, people must want to, because in a free society, we can't force people to do things they don't want to do. So if we get all of those four things to happen, then we can make change happen, and we can make change happen quickly if it all falls into place. The problem is it just takes one of them to be there, one of the barriers to be there, and nothing happens. And all around the world in different sectors of the economy, this is what we're seeing, and it's really stopping us from going at the technology transition, energy transition, full speed. And that brings us to the question: how do we accelerate the transition? Which ultimately, of course, is why we're asking these questions as economists. We want to help with the transition, both to make it happen, but also to make it happen in a way that is prosperous and equitable for populations. Now, certainly in my work at the World Bank, when we go to some of the poorest countries in the world, we need to take these things into account quite seriously. But first of all, to make the energy transition happen, it's about these barriers. The barriers are what's preventing change. If we want change to happen, then we need to put policies in place to get around those barriers. Now, as I said on the previous slide, all around the world, we have different problems, different barriers that are in place, and it's going to vary country by country. It will certainly vary sector by sector. Now, the logical conclusion from that is we need specific policies to address these barriers, and these policies are also going to change country by country and sector by sector. So as nice as it would be to say there's a silver bullet, one policy will solve everything, is not that simple, unfortunately. So that sets the scene. Now, coming to the role of economics in all of this, because economists are advisors to policymakers, and policymakers tend to listen to economists, rightly or wrongly, and the advice that economists give is taken seriously. Now, mainstream economics, which I will refer to throughout the rest of the slides, formally defined as the neoclassical school and its extension, environmental economics. Now, they've both been around a long time, and they're very well established. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, we'll see that many of the solutions I refer to later on have also been around similarly long times. Sometimes we talk about temperature change from climate change relative to pre-industrial levels. Well, purely by coincidence, this economics was invented around the same time in the second half of the 19th century. Leon Walras is a French economist who codified it. Environmental economics coming from originally Cambridge in the UK, another economist called Pigou, who invented the idea of using the taxation system to correct for some of the problems in a standard capitalist economy. Also been around a long time. These approaches are the standard in an economist toolbox. They will be the first thing they reach to when asked questions about any area of policy, really, but climate change and energy as much as anything else. Now, point 4 is important here because these types of economics, they focus on prices a lot, pretty much for everything. In fact, if you take it to the extremes. And this phrase, getting the prices right, we heard it, and I have to say, certainly in my institution, the World Bank has been thrown around a lot in the past 20 years for all kinds of problems. But for climate change, getting the prices right is basically sort of jargon for making people adopt the technologies that you want to, so the low carbon ones. Ideally, those prices would reflect the cost of climate change, which considers an externality. Again, that's jargon for something that happens outside the pure economy and the price-based system. Of course, we don't know what the cost of climate change would be, so that's an impossible ask. But if we can get the prices to incentivize people to change technology, then the economists think they've done their job. Now, for a long time, we've had this story, and we've had, but renewables are expensive, electric vehicles are expensive, everything else we need to reduce emissions is expensive. Now, that's actually never been true. There's always been lots of energy efficiency investments that are pretty cheap, things like loft insulation, blocking holes in your walls, fixing your window frames, not leaving the windows open, things like that have almost no cost to low cost. Certainly you will make the money back quite quickly. But nowadays, we're seeing this for the technologies as well. Solar power is already there. The prices are right. It's cheaper than everything else. Electric vehicles probably going to go the same way soon as well. But unfortunately, this is not solving the problem. People are still using all the old technologies as well, and even buying new versions of them. Coal power plants are still being built around the world. So this story from traditional mainstream economists that we just need to get the prices right, it's been found out. Now, it's clearly missing an important part of the story. And that's where I think these barriers and the policies to address them come in, and also where the economics that we use to study all of this needs to come in as well. So let's go through them. We don't need to spend too long on each one. Barrier number 1, ensure the technology exists. So standard economic approach is just to make assumptions about this. I know there are lots of jokes about economists making assumptions about unrealistic things, but this is a case where it really is true. The critical point is the second one here on the slide, saying the technologies that exist are independent of the policies. And this, in my own country, the UK, is something that's been recently proven spectacularly wrong with the case of offshore wind power, where about 10, 20 years ago, the government decided to develop an offshore wind industry. And the economists were all saying, no, don't do this. This is a bad idea. It's expensive. You could just build some gas-fired power plants instead, cut emissions. It would be a lot cheaper. What these guys missed was that as the UK developed the offshore wind, it got a lot cheaper along the way. And now it's far, far cheaper than natural gas-fired electricity generation. Even before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, when gas prices were lower, it still made sense to go to offshore wind. And this is all because of the policy that was put in place 10 to 20 years ago that the economists were all advising against. So there is a problem here. It's all in standard economics. We've got a lot of assumptions here that are really coloring the analysis that we're making and sometimes leading us to incorrect conclusions. It gets worse, unfortunately. The standard models used by the economists have assumptions about perfect knowledge, meaning, so effectively what happens here, the people are always assumed to behave rationally, so you take what's best for them, the most economic means of generating energy or getting the services that they need from energy. And to do that optimally, they have to know all the options out there, which means they need to effectively be all-knowing. Sometimes it gets extended to all-knowing about the future as well, which is pretty bonkers when you think about it and you take it outside an economic context. I've looked hard to see if anyone has ever tried to justify these assumptions. I've not found a single source. And in fact, there's been, even in mainstream economics, there has been, I think, 7 Nobel Prizes looking at issues of gaps in knowledge, imperfect information, things like that. So this is not something that's unknown. Unfortunately, it's still an issue in all the models that are being used, and it informs the views that economists give, and it's just an assumption that's not backed up by reality. Now, the issue about can take up the options, even in countries with capitalist economies, markets do not operate completely freely. We do have to acknowledge that China is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and it certainly does not have frictionless markets. Again, this is an assumption in mainstream economics that all of these things will work, and it just doesn't stand up very far. Some models are trying to deal with it, but most economic models are really making this assumption, and the example on the third point, when things start to get really crazy, that what economists call capital can just be moved from one sector and even one technology to another and somehow transform itself into something new is a real problem. For anyone that is familiar with stranded assets, if you've got a model that says a coal mine can become a wind turbine, then by definition you don't have any stranded assets, and you're missing a whole big part of the problem in the transition. So it's amazing that in some ways that we still have this, but in many of the models we do. And then the last one about people want to take up the options. Well, here the stuff about getting the prices right actually does have a role to play, because if all the options are there, people know about them, people can take them up. Getting the prices right will push many of them to actually do that. So there's a lot to take from the mainstream models and analysis here. The one thing I would say is the third point about sort of trends, people wanting to have stuff because their neighbors do. I mean, this is real. It's been explored in several different branches of economic literature, but it goes beyond the scope of what our current mainstream analysis can offer. But especially for climate change, where there is a sort of virtue signaling part of it, think about the number of people that bought Toyota Priuses because their neighbors did, and things like that. We are missing part of the story here. So there's a sort of tick here for mainstream economics, but there are gaps there too. Now, where all of this gets us, 2 main conclusions come out of this analysis. If we accept all of those assumptions, which is what we have in most of the models that are used for both research purposes and for policy analysis, if we accept both those assumptions, then almost by definition, a carbon price is the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It relies on the market to find the optimal solution. If we're assuming perfect markets, it sort of by definition provides the perfect outcome. Anything else is worse than perfect. So any other policy is considered wasteful. And there are many economists, or at least there certainly used to be, who would say, let's get rid of all the other policy and just replace it with a carbon tax or emission trading scheme, something price-based. The other conclusion is climate policy always has costs. Now, as it says on the slide, because everybody behaves rationally, markets are completely frictionless, everybody knows about everything, it's an optimizing situation. And we start off in an optimizing situation, we put a carbon emission constraint on there, we get to a constrained optimization. By definition, it can only get worse for in terms of what the economy can produce, people's welfare, things like that. Now, the charts on the right-hand side, these quite spectacular looking bar charts and box whisker diagram, they're from the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports from the recent one. The sixth assessment report is the bottom right, and the top right one is the previous one and the fifth assessment report. These are all the models that were used to produce that IPCC report, what they think the cost of meeting a 2-degree or 1.5-degree climate target would be. And it's the y-axis is GDP loss on both diagrams. So the models are pretty much guaranteeing there is a loss, there's a cost, apart from one run in the top right one, which I've never actually understood where that came from. But all the other models and all the other runs of those models are saying there has to be costs. And the message to policymakers is there has to be cost. But this is all of these models depend on all the assumptions that I showed on the past 4 slides. This is the result that we get. And this is what policymakers take from it. Now, okay, so getting to some of the criticisms of that. Here's some stuff from the broader literature. I was not involved in any of these. The first one in the top left, does optimization approximate real-world energy transition? So that's talking about human behavior, and it's saying this assumption about rational behavior and everybody optimizing, is it realistic or is it close to being realistic? Unfortunately, the answer was no, the conclusion from that paper. The bottom, the top right one, climate policy models need to get real about people, again focusing on this human behavior and gaps in knowledge. And this was actually written by the modelers themselves. It's a very interesting position that they started to effectively say that their own models, there were major problems with the results, and not just, potentially not just the scale of the impacts, but even the direction of the impacts. And then the bottom left one is about energy modeling specifically, and this is about technology rollout as well as behavior. And I mean, the paper itself is interesting enough, but somewhere near the bottom of the paper, they describe the methods, and they actually admit that in their optimization model that uses all the assumptions in the past 4 slides, to get something that looks realistic, they have to step into the model and make so many manual changes that they are almost determining the results themselves, and the model isn't actually doing very much on its own. So these guys who have been working with these mainstream models are starting to recognize the problems. Now, from my perspective, I've only ever touched on these models, and I work on alternative modeling approaches. Two things from my side. The left-hand side is a blog post, so a lot shorter than an academic paper. This was in response to what I thought was quite extreme by the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, who said something that I said was a conclusion in the previous slides, that these economists signed a statement saying that Europe should get rid of all other climate policy and just have a carbon price instead. The blog post says why that's a bad idea. the misuse of neoclassical economics. The language gets a bit coloured further down. It might be entertaining. More soberly on the right hand side, in the journal article, this was talking about the story that comes out of costs, why it's always costs, and why that depends on those assumptions that are made, and how we could get away from that. The message to policymakers, costs, is really telling them you want to do as little as possible. And in the political economy, all of these people that are elected want to be returned to power. This is what they take from it. We really want to do as little as possible. But also, when it comes to international negotiations and the UN process, we want to commit to as little as possible. That, if you think it's impossible to have any benefits from dealing with climate change, that is the position that you would take. But again, it's all dependent on these assumptions. Okay. All right, now let's get to the more interesting bit. What can we do about it? So starting from the basics, if we want to talk about energy transition from an economic perspective, and we want it to be realistic, we need to start thinking about these assumptions and thinking about the barriers, how to address the barriers, and what might happen if we do address the barriers. So I laid out 4 points that the models need to cover as a minimum to be able to do this. Technology development, I think that should be reasonably obvious. Human behavior, the financial sector, which has a special role in all of this that's actually excluded from the mainstream models, and then knowledge gaps. Now, I went into this when I was doing my own research, expecting to have to invent a lot of things. As we saw in the abstract, actually a lot of it has already been written down, but sometimes in different contexts, because these three old economists, Veblen from the end of the 19th century, Keynes and Sumter from the first half of the 20th century, they were around before climate change was an issue. Energy transition to these guys meant moving from a coal-based economy to oil-based economy. So they saw it, but it's in a completely different context to what we have today. But going back and reading the original text, actually, there's a lot that we can learn. So to get on top of this, we need to combine some ideas. We've got three different branches of heterodox economics here that all come from a different angle. The Venn diagram explains what the contribution of each one is, with the overlaps being sort of what we take from each one and how they interact with each other. Post-Keynesian economics has been around from Cambridge in the UK for a long time. Ecological economics, more recent, that was developed in the 1970s and was really about how we live within the confines of our natural planet. And then more recently, complexity economics, which develops also from evolutionary economics, which has in the past 10 to 20 years become more popular. I call the interaction of all of them systems economics because we're looking at the whole system, both natural and social. And we need to take these things, all the important features of those into account. Now, technology, so there's a whole field of innovation studies, which is mostly ignored by economists, which is a real shame. This is a diagram which is actually specific to climate policy, but it could be generalized into other policy areas as well, looking at how we go from concepts to products in the market. And there are these 6 stages along the way, starting basic research. So that's stuff that's done in universities and is mostly publicly funded because it's too far away from being commercial for companies to take much interest in. Then you shift from more the public sector towards the private sector as we go from left to right and the innovations become more advanced. And once we get to commercialization, that's when companies take over and we can rely on the private sector to develop the technologies because they can see the profit in it for them. And then, because market accumulation, diffusion, that's when products really become successful. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way. Technologies fail all the time. They could fail at any one of the 6 stages. And there may be policy interventions to help out with getting the right technologies into the right place. But this is the kind of thing we need to get into the models. What do we mean by innovation? The 2 types of innovation. I will come back to this in a later slide because it's quite an important distinction. Process and product innovation. Process innovation is making things more efficient, effectively. So it has a big role in the energy transition and dealing with climate change, because we want to keep on living our lifestyles, but putting fewer pressures on the planet. So process innovation, really important. Product innovation is when we invent new things, all the gadgets that we now enjoy living with. Product innovation uses more resources, but it also boosts our prosperity and makes our life more fun and interesting. How these things come together is a really important part of the transition. And in fact, Schumpeter and Veblen both talked about this in some detail about how technologies grow from other technologies. We combine existing technologies to get new things coming out of them, a bit like sort of building with Lego bricks. When the more we have, the more we put together, the more new things that we can make out of them. Now, in models and in economics, we have these curves that we can rely on to look at how technologies develop. The one on the left, the S-shaped curve, is how products get into the marketplace over time. They start off at 0. They're very niche. Very few people know about them. Very few people want to buy them. They're still probably expensive, so not very much happens. Once the technologies start to get established, they can take off rapidly, and we get to the steep part of the S-curve, and then you get towards market saturation at the end. This is standard. It's been shown across lots of different types of technologies, energy technology, but also communication technologies, transport technologies. It's all there in the historical data. The other one on the right is the learning curve, how things get cheaper over time. So this is really the process innovation part of it. People find ways to make things more efficiently. People make more of them, so economies of scale become possible. Also, more companies make them, so there's more competition, which drives down prices. Put these 2 things together, if you can hit the sweet spot of things getting cheaper rapidly and get onto that steep part of the S-curve, that's when change can happen very quickly, because the technologies become available, known about as well, and cheaper. Okay, now human behavior. If you look at Wikipedia, actually economics is defined as the study of human interactions, something like that. I don't recommend doing all your research on Wikipedia, but it does have its uses. If we don't take into account human behavior and how humans behave together, we're kind of not meeting that definition of economics. So we really should be getting it in there for all our economic analysis. It's tough though. It's not observable. We have to rely on what we can get from the data. So econometrics is often used. You get micro-level behavioral studies can be used as well. But for the energy transition, I think what's most important is these, what I say, micro-macro linkages, how people react to what other people are doing around them, how that will drive change and how it will drive rapid change, fashions and fads. There's a famous example that it used to be that every man wore a hat in public, and then over the space of about 3 years, it just stopped happening because the fashion changed. We've seen the same with ties more recently. It's just lots of people start doing it, everybody follows. This is, again, how to make change happen quickly. Financial sector, often underappreciated to the extent that we had to publish a whole journal article on it. It's the issue here is that there's a misunderstanding about the concept of money and finance and what it means. Generally, the view in economics, and certainly in mainstream economics, is that any money that's used to pay for or lent out to companies to pay for low carbon equipment, therefore has to get subtracted from something else. Right? There's a fixed quantity of money that you just allocate around. The empirical evidence shows this is not true at all. And if the models don't reflect this, we're giving a very biased view of what can happen. There are constraints in the economy about how much we can produce, absolutely, but the amount of money is not one of them, because the central bank and even commercial banks can make more of it with a keystroke. Okay, and finally, I think what is most fundamental of all of this is the gaps in knowledge, because it lays the foundations for everything else. People behave based on what they know about. What they don't know about cannot influence their behavior. Technology, it doesn't really make sense if we are all knowing, and certainly if we can predict the future. Technology is, and how technology develops, is uncertain in almost by definition. So we need to be able to take this into account, and it should be consistent across all the different aspects of things that we model. But it's particularly important for climate change, simply because the very idea, coming back to one of those first slides, the reason that we care about climate change is because we don't know what might happen if we try to push things too far. Okay, so I guess you're probably thinking, well, that's all nice, very, very abstract. What does it mean in reality? This is an exercise I did actually for my own PhD work, for my doctorate, which tried to look at each of the key assumptions that were made in mainstream economics and how they affect the results that come out of these climate models. So if you think back to those charts from the IPCC that showed the costs to GDP, here's a model simulation showing is the impact on GDP now. This is not costs, it's benefits. So the above the axis is actually positive numbers, below the axis is costs. And what I tried to do was to take a very non-mainstream model and fix it so that it produced the same assumptions as the mainstream models were doing. And the result of that exercise is the black line, the one at the bottom. That's what a standard CGE, that's computable general equilibrium model, IAM integrated assessment model, the models that are used in the IPCC reports and the mainstream policy analysis. The scenario is what would happen to global GDP for meeting a 1.5 degree temperature target. Underneath this, it breaks it down by country and sector as well, but these are just the global results. And you can see, make all the assumptions in the standard mainstream model, we get to about minus 15% of GDP, which is a lot, and it's kind of consistent with the IPCC results, even with some of the shortcuts I had to make to force the model to do that. If I relax the assumption about technology being fixed, then we get from the black line to the blue line. So the policies in this scenario, which include a whole load of regulatory policies, phasing out coal, subsidies for wind, solar, electric vehicles, all that kind of thing, as well as a carbon price. All of those policies help to push down the costs of the low carbon technologies, accelerating the energy transition, but also reducing the cost to society of doing so. When we get from the black line to the blue line, then if we relax the assumptions about human behavior and try to use an empirical human behavioral approach, which encompasses the gaps in the knowledge and all of that as well, we get a big jump from the blue line to the green line. And of course, now we actually start to see positive impacts. And here the financial system is important again as well, because it provides the finance to get that bump early. And that bump early is all the investment that needs to be made mostly in solar power around the world, which generates jobs, generates value added, generates GDP. It also generates debt, which gets repaid later in the period, and that kind of pulls down the economic results. And the last two lines, something I haven't talked about just because of time, but if we add in the benefits of improved air quality from less air pollution, and also the reduced climate damages as well, we can start to see even higher impacts. But the point to take from this is that all of the assumptions that are being made in the mainstream models, they're all pushing that line downwards and increasing the costs. And that's how we get to that story of costs. If we want to do something about climate change, we need to get away from. Okay, concluding slides. What can we learn from this? So on methods, so first point, I think what economists have done really well is to simplify the problem as much as possible, which, yes, in some senses makes it easier to understand, but the cost of simplifying it has guided us into a misleading path. We can do better if we go outside standard textbook economics. We look at certainly innovation studies. We dip into evolutionary complexity economics, explore some of the old works by Keynes, certainly Schumpeter as well, and even as far back as Veblen, to think about human behavior a bit better. These are kind of all over the place, simply because this work was done in different decades, in different parts of the world, at a time when climate change and energy transition was not an issue. But people are now bringing them together. And yes, not much of it is new. I would like to take credit for all of it, but really all I've done is repeat the research that has been around for decades and even more than a century in some cases. But the task, as Schumpeter said, with how technologies are formed by bringing things together, that's what we're doing here. And what does it mean for policy people? Yes, let's try and get rid of this message. It's all about costs. It's not a good story. They can't sell it to their citizens, to their voters. If we really want to push people to start taking action, this story about costs has to change. The policy mix, carbon prices get a lot of attention for two reasons. One, because the standard models say it's the best policy you can use. Second, because it's actually the only policy that a lot of these models can look at. So it just goes in almost by default. Climate action equals carbon price, which is a bit silly, because most of the emission reductions to date have not been because of carbon prices. They've been because of regulatory policy and technology policy as well. Product and process innovation. I think this is a way of thinking that we need to keep in mind. Product innovation is very difficult to model. It's very difficult to understand. It's very uncertain. But actually, when we're talking about the energy transition, it's really process innovation that we're more interested in, and that is a lot easier to predict. System resilience, which I would have liked to talk about, but just because of time, I've not been able to. This is the question about, okay, we accelerate the energy transition, what happens? GDP may go up a bit, it may go down a bit, but there'll be a lot of tensions in the system. And the closer we move to an optimal system, the less room for maneuver we have, which again is a reason it's kind of crazy that we use optimization models for all of this, because the most optimal world is the least resilient one. We need to have space for when things go wrong. And policies should take that into account. And the policies in many other sectors, like healthcare, defense, they always think about resilience before optimizing. And then final point, climate change is not going to go on its own. There's a whole ton of other things that are going on. You just have to pick up a newspaper to see most of it. It just increases the complexity further, and it means we always need to be on our toes and updating our thinking, because it's going to change continuously over the coming decades. So that's all. Very happy to take questions. And again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, Hector. We do have a decent number of questions or comments that people are making, so we'll see if I can get through them here. Maybe I'll start at one towards the end. Are there any engineers and geologists at the World Bank? Do they hire these people, or is it all economists?
Engineers, absolutely. You think about the things that the World Bank funds around the world. A lot of it is in the energy system. A lot of it's in the water system. There's some extractives as well. This is all stuff that we would not be able to do without having engineers. And in those divisions, it's mostly engineers. So in some places, economists are actually in the minority. So yeah, don't if you're an engineer, certainly a possible path. Geologists, yes, again within the extractors team, definitely a role there, but not as many as engineers.
Right. So one question early on was, you say people have to want to take up technologies. Is there more you can say on that in terms of how you think about modeling that or understanding it? And I think one of the contexts is, let's just say, taking solar on your roof. Do people really want to become a mini utility or something and have that extra thing to deal with? Or maybe some really want to because they're tech nerdy people and some don't. So anything more you can say about modeling how people want to take up technologies or understanding policy for that?
Yeah, so questions of human behavior. There is no single model of human behavior that's been proved empirically correct. What seems very likely is that there are different layers to human behavior. First of all, we have our basic survival instincts, which we can't override. Now, I think we're probably operating above that level when we talk about energy transition. But the pressures that we have from society, the social norms, these are very powerful. And certainly for products where there is some kind of signaling, then this is going to be even more important. Now, solar panels on the roof could be a good example. Electric vehicles is even more so, because you take it around with you and people see you driving it and they see it in your driveway. So there's that level, and then there's the individual level above that. And I suspect for things like heat pumps, the individual level is more important, because here there is a cost to it, of course, but there's a lot of hassle because many people had to change their entire plumbing system to get it to work. And even aside from the cost, that is a big barrier to overcome.
Right. Here's one that's a little, I guess, human behavior-ish, but a little bit more on, I don't know, business and economics. So how do you deal with, maybe not in general, modeling, take your pick how to answer it. How do you deal with rich entrenched interests that can defeat clean energy by lobbying and influencing policymakers? How is that something that can be understood in this kind of economic modeling context, or is this too hard?
Yeah, I mean, right at the beginning, I talked about institutions, and these lobbying groups are very powerful institutions that are able to shape behavior. And we've seen in the past examples of well-meaning and well-structured climate policies that have failed because of lobbying. Like the Australia carbon tax is a great example. The mining companies managed to persuade people to vote against their own interests because they were going to receive all the money, but they still voted against it because the mining companies persuaded them that it wasn't a good idea. We have to think about power relationships. Here, actually, another branch of economics, Marxist economics, could give us a lot of insights. Not something I have much expertise in, and not something that you would go around the World Bank citing widely, either, I have to say. But these power relationships are super important, and we just have to look around at what's happening right now to understand that. And there's kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism here, because money comes with power. But the way to get around it is to try to put these mechanisms into reverse, to start draining the power and the money, and eventually it will collapse in a spiral. But those first steps are the most difficult, for sure.
Right. All right, I'll ask this one. I think it kind of, flips, or at least makes you think about technology change in some sense for fossil fuels. I'll just state it that way. So here's the question: to what extent do existing economic models for energy transition account for the socioeconomic benefits historically associated with fossil fuels, such as there's more energy services and what's come along with it, life expectancy, mortality rates, et cetera. So if you're calculating the cost of moving away from what has effectively enabled 8 billion people today, how well do you think models account for the fossil fuel benefits and costs, as well as renewable technologies and innovation in fossil fuels, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I mean, the models go back, say, 30, 40 years at most. So we don't have a level of detail within the data to sort of look back through the Industrial Revolution. But it's unarguable that this immense prosperity was created as we found these energy sources that we didn't find them. We knew we were there, but we knew how to harness them to produce the things that we needed to drive that prosperity. As we move away from fossil fuels, the aim, of course, has to be to get the same level of energy services coming out the other end. So energy efficiency has to maintain the same room temperature. It's not about living in a colder room, for example. If we start to take the approach that we just use less energy, then we are going to go backwards. I think there is no way about that. The links between GDP and other measures of prosperity and energy use they seem very tight. So the question really is, how, if we move to renewables and other low carbon technologies, how do we still maintain that same level of energy service? And that's the sort of the hump that we're still trying to get over in many sectors. I think for the power sector, everything is now in motion because the costs are coming down, and effectively they're going to offer the same services as fossil fuels but cheaper. Cars, we've still got some way to go with the range on the vehicles, for example, and in other sectors a very long way to go. And really that's the challenge. But if all we're offering is a loss of prosperity, then we will hit that barrier that people don't want to do it. And I don't see any way beyond that without the technology improving further.
Right. For those interested in perhaps a slightly different take, we did have Julia Steinberger here a couple of years ago speaking about, yes, decent living energy standards, how you might have a good lifestyle with lower energy consumption. So a different view, or at least another view of concern on Hector's point there. Let's see. How about, let me take this one. Maybe gets into the concept of money and what's money, sort of. In the models, how is pricing implemented typically, or where and how was revenue from carbon pricing, say, recycled into the system? Has carbon revenue ever recycled by payments to individuals or households? Anyway, maybe it's a general question about what's the role of carbon pricing? How do you track the flow of that money? And I'll just add, how is that question a correct question or incorrect question from the treating money in a model? Yeah.
First I would start by saying it's our correct question for sure, because this is the kind of real world question that gets asked. If we shift away from fossil fuels, we are going to lose tax revenues just for excise duties on, say, for vehicle fuels, if nothing else. The carbon tax will raise revenues. Yeah. Usually the models will assume that when they run a scenario, they will assume that the government balance doesn't change. So there's no stimulus effect from government. There's no austerity effect from government. And that's just to help with the interpretation of results, because I mean, generally, any scenario where you pump more money into the economy, you'll see a boost. Any scenario where you take money out of the economy, you will see a loss. But so, whereas what we want to look at is how effective the policy is. Now, the question about how to use the revenues from the carbon taxes in that sense, actually, it can be more important for determining the GDP outcomes than the carbon tax itself, because use these revenues productively, and you can see quite big boosts to the economy. Use them inefficiently, then it kind of just die away, and you just get the additional costs of the carbon tax. So very, very important question. To get at least a short-term stimulus effects, putting it into something that boosts spending is the most effective way of doing it. Basically, if the money's saved rather than spent, it doesn't go into creating jobs in other sectors. And I mean, putting the money into green or low carbon investment, again, it just gets it into the economy, it creates jobs in those sectors, and you start to get fiscal multiplier effects, meaning the money just gets spent around the economy more. So that's effective. Anything where the money is usually saved, which looks, according to the data, anything that boosts company profits here is not such a good idea for using the money. But it does depend on country and sector as well. But it's an important question. And on the second part, on the definition of money, we shouldn't have to make this assumption in the models that the government always balances the budget, but it is just for interpreting results. I think it's a useful scenario assumption to make.
Right. I'll ask this one. So thanks for everyone. I think we maybe have more than I can ask to finish up here. So it's good that you've all attended. Hector, you've attracted a good crowd. You were at the World Bank and you used to not be. You were at least a consulting firm. So who's listening and adopting these kinds of alternative methods as you're discussing? Is the World Bank trying to use these alternative methods? Or who's really thinking about this and trying to do it?
Wow,
Besides
that's a great question, putting me on the spot, and
well, I didn't make
possibly
it
lining up to be fired quite soon.
Okay.
Okay. No, I mean, in all seriousness, in Europe, this messaging got through to the European Commission, which is the civil service branch of the European system. They make all the energy policy at European level, which is most of the policy actually across Europe. And they use a mainstream model and they use a non-mainstream model that uses alternative assumptions. And initially they weren't very impressed with it because they got two sets of results. If the results between the two models were similar, they said, "Well, why did we pay money to do this when we get the same results from two models?" If the results were different, of course, they liked that even less because they didn't know they wanted to know which one was right. But over time, we sat down with them. We explained why you get the differences, in what contexts the different models would be closer to reality, and the different uncertainties. And they actually started to get some quite important policy messages from this. Because I'll give you one example for the energy efficiency directive, which was really pushing out very efficient appliances in European countries. One of the models, the non-mainstream model, said it would be good for the economy and it would create a lot of jobs. The mainstream model actually said no, it won't create jobs. It will have a cost. And they said to us, what do we need to do to get the good results and not the bad results? And we discussed it for a couple of minutes, and then we said, well, look, it's about capacity. If the companies have the capacity to produce the stuff, you get the good results. If they don't have the capacity, you get the bad results. You're talking about a policy that's going to be implemented in 5 years' time. Tell the companies it's coming so they can prepare, then you will get the good results. They sat down and went, yeah, that's actually really important for us. So there is benefits from using the combined approach. At the World Bank, yeah, I mean, as I said, as I started, there are very inconsistent views across different teams and individuals. What we need when we work at the World Bank with some of the poorest people in the world, we just need stuff that works. So we don't adhere to any particular theory when it comes to it's a very pragmatic approach, and if it's mixing and matching, then we will do it. But it's I think it's all of these quite small real world factors that any model can't misses. We just always have to work around that. So it's not necessarily the model that guides things. It provides a framework, and then a lot of analysis is done around that.
Right. All right. Well, maybe we'll end with this one. I think you kind of answered it there, but it's kind of a nice, simple question. It's one of those simple ones that maybe puts you on the spot too much as well. So somebody referring to your messaging about costs, if you're saying it's thinking about climate change, mitigation is not all about cost. So if that message doesn't resonate, what is the role of economists in stewarding a climate stable future? Is it to learn the methods you're talking about, to use a diversity of methods, or to, I don't know, maybe go through that explanation you just went with people trying to make policy decisions and say, well, this is really kind of what the different models are telling you.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question. I think the economists are the people that they should have the overview of how society works, and in some ways they're connectors, that you've got all the different areas of expertise, and the natural scientists, the engineers, and people that have their own areas of specialisms. And the macroeconomists, they pull everything together to get this overview, and that with that does come a big responsibility. And it's why our government, especially in the UK and European countries, that there are a lot of economists who are advisors and feeding into policy decisions. So yeah, with that responsibility, we do have to be careful for sure. And yeah, this is where, because it almost is the motivation behind this work, is to actually identify where the messaging has gone a bit off track because of the simplifications that we've had to make things understandable, and see how can we bring it back to really help, because we're in a time of need right now, and we need to make this change happen. And the faster we can make it happen while still maintaining stability within our societies, then yeah, the brighter the future will be for all of us.
Right. Well, I definitely liked your framing of the blending of the three sort of schools or areas of economics: post-Keynesian, ecological, and complexity. So with that said, thank you for joining us today. It's been Hector Pollitt, Senior Economist at the World Bank. Thanks for sharing your thoughts today on the University of Texas Energy Symposium.
Thank you.